I am a junior psychology major here at the college. However, I also have 2 minors in sexuality and queer studies and history, which is how this presentation came about in the queer history class I took last semester with Dr. Lindsay Warren. I'd also like to note that I have the absolute privilege of presenting this at the WGSS conference at Seton Hall at the end of March, so I hope you enjoy it as much as the people there enjoyed it as well. So to start off with, I have to introduce the topic before we get into it. In order to understand the work queer farmers do, we have to understand the environment they live in, which is rural areas. Then after we get into how agriculture is done, we're getting into barriers, and then finishing it off with some closing thoughts. So to start off with, we all have that stereotypical idea of what a farmer is. It's a cis-het white man with his wife and his 6 kids all running the farm, so they can make ends meet. It's a joint unit of like household income and things like that. However, it's important to note that these gender roles were taught. In the 1930s, the USDA observed a low birth rate in rural areas, and so they implemented the 4-H program, which quite literally taught gender roles in public schools. So wholesome heterosexual marriage was quite literally taught. So that's where we have that. It's also important to note that typically in queer studies, it's thought of that capitalism is how queer people have escaped the nuclear family. This is from capitalism allowing for individuals to have their own incomes and not rely on a family unit for income. So that allowed queer people to move to urban environments, have their own set income, and be independent from their families, which also allowed them to have like to be more vocal about their own identities as well. And then to finish off, the basis of my paper is in Bromsberg's idea of queer labor, which is found in their 2018 textbook, which is labor done by the wrong gender. So this could be women doing typically masculine jobs or men doing typically feminine jobs. It's also labor that lives outside the norm. So this also includes union work as well. So I argue that agriculture, when performed by queer people, is queer labor. This is due to queer farmers define stereotypes about farming being a white cis-het male occupation, and in doing so, queer farmers use environmentalist, sustainable, anti-colonial, and restorative lenses to do their labor. This lens further queer the labor by working against oppressive systems and thus having this specific labor live outside the norm. So moving on to queer people in rural areas. Rural areas are stereotyped as the enemy territory by straight people and queer people alike. An example of this being supported is when gay marriage was legalized in the early 2000s, as a lot of rural environments met gay marriage with malice. They didn't like it due to religious reasons. However, this isn't the case for everybody. There's been a historic lack of visibility of queer people in rural areas, and that presents us with a sort of chicken or the egg problem, where are queer people not visible because of the homophobic environments, or are there homophobic environments because of the lack of visibility of queer people, and people aren't being educated because there's no queer people visible enough to teach them? Answer is that is probably both. However, queer people do exist in rural areas, and perceived heterosexism prevents them from being visible and from us learning about them. So moving on into how the agriculture is done. This is broken down into 4 sections, and we're going to start off with environmentalism. Environmentalism in queer farming dates all the way back to the 60s and 70s to the Women Back to Land movement, which was done during the second wave of feminism. This is when women wanted to live outside the male gaze, have their own societies, and move to rural areas together, create the same sex environment, which is inherently queer. There were a lot of lesbians that wanted to farm and be away from male gaze and be around women, as one would. And in this environment, there was a magazine called Country Women, and this is where sustainable practices would be exchanged. This is where women would learn about these sustainable practices. It was like the basis of their movement as well. Moving on to the 90s, the Tuscaloosa county-supported agricultural project was run by our favorite lesbian couple, Jean and Carol. And Jean and Carol heard their customers, their community's concerns about food safety, and instead of using harmful pesticides and things like that, they prioritize their relationship with the land. They want to make sure that their land is healthy, so they use organic products like rock phosphates as fertilizer and plant-friendly and insect-friendly plants for pesticides. So they were able to balance both the concerns of their customers as well as making sure that it aligned with their beliefs. So overall, queer farmers do not farm for profit. They prioritize relationship with the land. This is not true for all queer farmers, but it's true for most based on the research that I found. And this brings us to anti-colonialism. Because prioritizing the relationship with the land is an inherently indigenous ideology. So queer farmers work against the injustice of land ownership. As you all are probably aware, white cishet men are typically land owners. This dates back to enslavement of Black people in the United States, where there was white cishet men on the plantations. They got to reap all the profits of it, while BIPOC were underpaid workers, if they were even paid at all, which they weren't in times of enslavement. So queer farmers work against this norm. Anita, who's a queer Indian farmer, is the founder of Not Our Farm, which is a way for queer farmers of color to come together, have that relationship with each other, and also for a way to Anita to make sure that her workers are treated fairly and securely. It's a way for them to interrupt the racist capitalist system that is inherently the basis of farming and agriculture. And then moving on to the Queer Farming Network, which is a grassroots organization, although it is founded by a majority of white queer farmers. At the end of their homepage, you could find BIPOC-owned farms and specifically give those individual farms reparations in order to work against the injustice of land ownership and work against this colonial system that is embedded in agriculture. Continuously, environmentalism and anti-colonialism are inherently intersectional with anti-capitalism, as environmentalism prioritizes the relationship with the land over profit, while capitalism is built on profiting for yourself, and anti-colonialism works against worker exploitation, while capitalism thrives on exploiting workers in order to get the most profits. So Anita, as seen in the last slide, prioritizes equitable pay standards in the cooperative business model. So she makes sure that her workers are paid fairly, treated fairly, have good conditions over getting her own profits herself. So although this is also partially due to the fact that she's been exploited as a queer farmer of color, she doesn't want anyone else to experience that as well. And then another example of anti-capitalism can be seen in Miriam, a 23-year-old pansexual Iowan farmer, and who says that embracing their queerness has allowed them to embrace anti-capitalism because queerness inherently lives outside the norm. Anti-capitalism also lives outside the norm, so this allowed Miriam to just take that next step there and continue to break stereotypes and norms and just feel more like themselves. Miriam was allowed to prioritize their own happiness over their own labor due to embracing their queerness and then anti-capitalist notions that they find to be connected with their queerness. And then dating back to the 90s, back to our favorite lesbians, Jean and Carol, they had people buying weekly shares of vegetables. And although one could argue that this is kind of capitalist, as people are sort of investing their money into the farm, they only care about the farm because they have money invested in. I more see this as a way to move rural communities into a more anti-capitalist area to live in because they're investing in the people. It allows the community to come together to care about this one farm run by queer people and move away from this more individualistic culture that the these communities could be living in. Last but not least, we have identity affirming. This is typically found for trans farmers, but it applies to everybody. This is mostly seen in the idea of work clothes, which is when, listen, no matter what your gender is, if you're on a farm, you gotta wear overalls, you gotta wear a work shirt, you gotta wear boots in order to be able to do the labor that you are assigned. They don't care if you're a girl or a boy or anything in between, as long as you could toss a bale of hay over to the truck. Although this allows for it's also important to know that this allows for a more expansive gender expression for women as opposed to men that are still forced into that masculinizing territory. However, it's also more expansive than urban areas because urban areas are still gendered in many ways. Like the jobs there are still gendered, so people still have to dress accordingly, even if they have that individual freedom and can dress themselves later at night. In rural areas, queer people can kind of dress however they want most of the time. My favorite quote when doing this research is from Goose, who says that gender euphoria is driving a tractor, which also shows that the labor being done, the work that is being done, is also gender affirming for queer and trans farmers. This is continued with Jonah Mossberg, who's a trans farmer from Connecticut, saying that farming is the reason that he is comfortable in his body based on what I said before, and also to increase visibility of queer and trans farmers, he filmed a grassroots documentary called Out Here. So moving on to barriers, spoiler alert, they're all connected because all systems of oppression are connected and they all build on top of each other. So starting off at the government level, in agriculture in the USDA, women are seen as a protected class. This is because the USDA realized, women are less likely to own land as opposed to men. Oh, this is due to historical systemic barriers. Let's give them special loans to get land so more women can own farms and they'll be put on a more equal playing field. This theoretically could be done to queer farmers as well, based on everything else I'm going to tell you. However, the USDA census is not inclusive. They only ask about gender, being male or female, and marital status, married or not married. They don't even ask about sexuality, it's just assumed to be heterosexual. And when former President Joe Biden proposed a more inclusive census, he was criticized for being too woke. So the government is perpetuating this heterosis sexism, which just influences the societies that people live in. So in those societies, we have an example of Alex Paul, who when he was first getting his apprenticeships, he's a gay farmer, he was met with hostility from one of his coworkers who would openly talk about all the acts of violence he would commit against gay people if he ever met a gay person, which doesn't make you want to continue in that field or continue that training, even if farming is something that you love, which leads us to a lack of training for queer farmers. It's needed to get an apprenticeship in order to farm, because you are taught the skills that you need in order to take care of the land, take care of animals, things like that. And without this training, you cannot do those things. And 27.7% of queer farmers report a lack of training due to their queer identities, because some of them may be afraid to get into apprenticeships because of perceived heterosexism, or maybe they already experienced heterosexism and they had to leave their apprenticeship because of that. Or maybe they couldn't find an apprenticeship with an affirming person, or maybe the only queer farmer that they do know cannot take them on because all the other aspiring queer farmers are flocking to them to get that training. This leads to a lack of financial stability, because if you're not trained, you cannot do higher paying jobs. You're stuck with the lower paying labor, which leads to land access. There's a huge wealth gap between LGBTQ and cis-het farmers, and this only increases if the farmer is BIPOC. So if you can't take care of the land because you don't have the training, you're not going to be able to own the land. And if you're not getting a higher paying job, you're not going to be able to save up for the land and pay for that. It's also important to note that in farming communities, land is typically passed down from generation to generation. However, there are times when people come out as queer and their families take that land away from them, and they're like, I'm not gonna have you inherit this land despite the fact that you were working towards this your whole life because of your sexuality. So that also leads to further financial instability. Additionally, if queer farmers do end up accessing land in some way, it's very hard to pass it down, as queerness inherently rejects heteronormative marriage. They may not have children to pass the farm down onto, so they have to go out and find people that are willing to be trained for the land, that are willing to take care of them in their old age when they can no longer run the farm, and this isn't accessible to everybody, and instead the lands could be sold to big corporations, and we don't want that because they have unethical standards. So, in conclusion, there is a huge lack of visibility of queer farmers. This is seen in the very few primary sources I found when doing this research. Most of the primary sources I found were niche blog posts, which you wouldn't find unless you know what you were looking for, know what search terms to use. And if I did find some newspaper articles from the 90s to like get a historical lens, however, most of these were about queer farmers and were more about queers in rural areas and not their work in farming specifically. The best I got was Jean and Carol, and that was only one article out of like the dozen I was reading. And although it's not stated here, most of the secondary sources are qualitative works, and I love qualitative research. I think it's very important. However, you cannot tell the disparities between queer and trans farmers and cishet farmers if you don't have the numbers. There was only one study with the statistic I showed you before that is more comprehensive than the census we currently have on farmers. So all of these things, the lack of stability, the lack of primary sources and secondary sources, continues to perpetuate this stereotype that queer and trans people don't belong in farming, when that is inherently not true. So, in conclusion, the revolutionary work done by queer farmers not only works against systems of injustice, but it creates queer joy. Queer farmers have allowed themselves to bond with nature, accept their own identities through farming, and to honor this, scholars should continue to develop this field and aid in making this information more accessible. Thank you. Any questions?